Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today I'm going to be talking about Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition and the Space Force, the U.S. Space Force, our new military branch. All right, so what do those two topics have to do with each other? Well, one, I'm a skilled veteran dungeon master, and like every skilled veteran dungeon master, that means I have my own, specifically I have my own world. Now, my world is Thracion, and it's a custom world, right? And the reason why I think veteran dungeon masters actually use specifically why they use specifically their own custom worlds is you control everything. You determine the politics, you determine the culture, and you determine the society between all the inhabitants of that world. So it's just a huge amount of control. And I think, when you're a skilled veteran dungeon master, you're like, I don't want to be running somebody else's stuff, right? I want to run my stuff. So that's, I think, why you graduate to that, right? So when you are running your own custom world, one of the things that you do is you get to the point where you are specifically saying, okay, I live in this world, but I'm telling the stories in this world, right? So if that's the case, you want to be telling, you want to have elements within your world where you could talk about the politics of your own world, the culture of your own world, and the society of your own world, right? So you want allegories, you want allegorical elements, right? So basically, if something big comes along in our world, you're like, hey, do I want to put that into my world, right? So if there's some big, huge change in my real world, do I want to, my IRL world, do I want to put that into Thracion? Well, I looked at the Space Force, right? So I'm like, now I was shocked at the coverage of the Space Force, right? So the question is, do I want to put the Space Force into Thracion? Well, the first thing is this something of importance? Is this something of significance in IRL, right? In real life, right? So I was stunned when I saw coverage, right, and people on Twitter and Facebook commenting that the Space Force was unnecessary or unimportant. This is a absolutely ludicrous, ridiculous idea, and anyone who's saying it is just like not paying attention and has not read widely, right? So let's talk about it, right? Why is the Space Force a freaking awesome idea, an amazing idea, and absolutely important and incredibly important that America moves forward with it? Well, let's talk about it, right? And the reason why, this is connecting to Dungeons & Dragons is, if it is something of significance and it's of something of importance, I want it in my Thracion world, right? So I thought about the Space Force, right? And the first thing is, this is another armed military branch, right? So this has to do with war, right? Well, how are wars won, right? Well, the first thing you have to do when you look at a war is, there's 3 pillars of war: intelligence, logistics, and force, okay? You need to know what the situation is. You need to be able to move material around. And the reason you need to move that material around is you have to supply your force, right? Whatever you're using to physically win that war. Now, up for a long time, that's been boots on the ground soldiers, right? Okay. But, let's think about the Space Force from the perspective of intelligence, logistics, and force. And I was absolutely shocked to see the number of people in the media who were saying that the Space Force was not necessary. This looks to me exactly like when virtually the entirety of all of the media was like, we think this thing's going to happen in 2016. Oh, and it went the exact opposite way in 2016. Shocking, right? Space Force is exactly the same. 98% of all media is 100% wrong on the Space Force. Here's why, okay? Intelligence. If you have a Space Force, what is the swiftest, most accurate, most thorough way to get intelligence in the world today? That is satellites. If you have a Space Force, you are going to physically control every satellite, right? Like, that's a no-brainer, right? Let's talk about logistics. If you have an orbital logistics hub, you're going to be able to get material to anywhere on the Earth faster than anyone on the Earth, right? It's just, an orbital logistics hub it'd have no peer, right? You absolutely would not be able to move goods anywhere in the world faster than if you have an orbital logistics hub. And last is force, right? Well, if you have orbital platform weapons, if you have weapons on platforms in orbit, you're going to be able to deliver force anywhere in the world far more efficiently than anyone who doesn't have a space force, right? Like, now, everything I just said, this is old hat. This is ridiculously old information. This came out with Robert Heinlein's book, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, in the late 60s, right? In the late 60s. Everything I just said is a ridiculously old concept, at least 30 to 40 years old, right? It's over 40 years old, right? It's literally, I think The Moon is a Harsh Mistress came out like 68. It's literally 50 years old that everything I just said is already known, right? So, and, you know, honestly, if you look at the Space Force, any nation without a Space Force versus a nation with a Space Force, that's going to be like a woman armed with a Nerf sword going against a trained, proficient swordswoman who's dual-wielding katanas. It is going to be a bloody mess, right? There, you know, if any nation with a Space Force going against countries without a Space Force, it's gonna be over before the war starts. It's, you know, like, so the idea that the U.S. should not have a Space Force is absolutely ludicrous, and that opinion can only be preserved in the most shocking ignorance, right? If you didn't understand what Robert Heinlein was saying in 1968. So, right, once you realize that the Space Force is significant and important, right, I realize that I want to have that right over in Thracion. So I need to move that over into my D&D world, right? So let me tell you about my D&D world. So let's talk about Thracion for a minute. So Thracion has a north and a south kingdom, okay? It has specifically Siln, which is the southern kingdom, and that has King Zaquet and Queen Evanche, right? Now, the northern kingdom is Montoshal, and that had King Hagni and Queen Niera. They are both dead in that world. They recently died, right? And now that entire kingdom is being run by Treasurer Frey, who is a merchant, and he is leading all the other merchants in determining who the actual successor to King Hagni is, right? So and essentially that entire kingdom is being run by merchants currently who are investigating who King Hagni's actual, who his successor should be, right? Now, he actually had no children with Queen Yera, and that's one of the problems. He had a few children beyond his wife, Yera, so that's part of the issue, right? And so that is all going on, right? So the kingdom in the south, the southern kingdom, right, now has a monarchy, while the kingdom in the north is lacking a monarchy. And so King Zaquet is in a situation where he needs to be looking and saying, okay, I have an opportunity to expand my military force in a way, and there's no way that the merchants can match that, because they're just dealing with keeping the people from overthrowing them and immediately putting a king on the throne, right? So he has an opportunity to expand his military force. So I was thinking about this, and I'm like, okay, so how does Zaquet, how should I have Zaquet establish a space force within the realm of Siln, right, the southern kingdom? What does that look like in Dungeons and Dragons, right? Well, the first thing is I was like, oh, I know what that looks like. That's an army of monsters, right? And the reason why is this is very natural. All these Dungeons and Dragons, this is my own custom Dungeons and Dragons world. And, of course, it has monsters from the Monster Manual, right? So to me, that would be the logical next step, right? And then I realized, actually, we skipped a step, right? So the Space Force is above and beyond what the U.S. has already done. And that is drones, right? So drones were really, we put drones into every single military force that existed, right? But I didn't have any equivalent of that within Siln, right? And so I'm like, okay, how do I make Siln catch up, right? And so I think that's an army of monsters, right? So one, King Zaquet would go, okay, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and send out these people and have them establish an army of monsters where, we'll have a force of boulets who will break into an area, right? That kind of thing. And so, that's one of the next steps, right? But then I realized that really isn't an equivalent to a space force. So what is a space force? Well, a space force in Dungeons and Dragons, that is going to be control of the astral plane, That is the equivalent to a Space Force. So he would take his court of wizards and have them actually, put forward wizards who would be soldiers in the astral plane, beginning getting intelligence from the astral plane, putting logistics into the, supplies into the astral plane that can be brought out again, and then finally be able to launch force from the astral plane. So, when I thought about the Space Force, I was like, oh my gosh, this is important. This is, and should be effective. I want to have this real world element reflected in my Dungeons and Dragons campaign so that my campaign continues to be a strong platform to tell stories that reflect the political, cultural, and societal elements within IRL, right? And so to me, the equivalent of drones is an army of monsters, and the equivalent of the Space Force would be for a monarch to send forces in to control the astral plane. So that's my concept of the Space Force in Dungeons and Dragons. Take care.